Riding with the Valkyries into number 10 is Gullveig of the Nordic Ascendant. Nordic's archetypal link monster that's actually allowed for the strategy to keep up in the modern era. In order to make Gullveig, you need to use any level 5 or lower Nordic monster, which is almost any Nordic except for Fenrir and Jormungandr, making it pretty easy to go into. And it has a nice secondary effect that rewards you for summoning out your boss monster, as any Asia it points to can't be targeted by your opponent's card effects, all while Gullveig itself will be protected from being able to be attacked. But the really valuable part about Gullveig is what happens when it's link summoned, as she allows you to banish up to 3 cards from your hand or field to special summon up to 3 Nordics from your deck. But you'll end up being locked into only being able to summon Asia monsters for the rest of the turn. Now, we've definitely poked fun at a couple of Nordic monsters in the past because at a quick glance, some of them are pretty terrible. Most of the Nordic beasts all have battle phase oriented effects, some of the cards have awkward restrictions, and in general, the archetype struggles to establish a real on-field presence with just its main deck monsters, which for a while made actually summoning out any Asia monster more of a miracle than bringing out an Egyptian god. Especially because not only do your Asias require at least 2 non-tuners, but they each need a specific kind of Nordic monster to bring out. Odin needs Ascendants, Loki needs Alfars, and Thor needs Beasts. But Gullveig existing actually solves a lot of Nordic's issues, and makes their archetype worth playing. Because now, by summoning even the worst Nordic you can think of, you have a way of bringing out 3 of your best Nordics from the deck. While this is a pretty heavy investment of resources because of cards you have to banish, it's actually somewhat worth it, because not only do you get the specific setup you need to bring out any Asia monster you could want, but you also get the chance to summon Alvis, which has a graveyard effect to summon another Asia from your extra deck if your opponent deals with one on the field. And Ivaldi, a way to search out your Nordic relics, some of which have some pretty solid effects and can even serve as interaction. And even after Gullveig has used its effect, it existing on the field further increases the strength of your board by making the Asias you summon untargetable, which makes a 4000 attack Odin a lot harder to deal with. So with Gullveig netting you so much, why is it even on this list at all? Well, that has to do with the general power levels of Link 1s being so high that there aren't actually that many truly awful ones. There are just some that are slightly worse than others, which is going to be a pretty common theme on this list. In the case of Gullveig, in comparison to other Link 1s, she requires a lot more. Banishing 3 is a huge loss of card advantage. And while there are some specific hands that can fulfill this requirement easily, or can combo well, it's going to feel pretty awful if you ever have to give up a hand trap or floodgate just to get your engine online. Especially because Gullveig is the only real way of getting your deck running, because Nordic is almost entirely reliant on her resolving in order to do anything of note, which makes her a huge target for interaction. And if this effect is ever stopped, you're left high and dry because most of the Nordics surrounding Gullveig that you're forced to play just to enable her, don't do enough to help you push through interaction. And while Nivaldi, Hildskalf, and Gullinbursty can theoretically help out, you need a pretty specific hand in order for Nordics to beat a hand trap in engine. But even if she does end up resolving and everything goes right, Gullveig's lock makes it so that you only have one play. Summon out Ivaldi to get a Nordic relic, your tuner of choice, and another body to make up the right levels for an Asia monster. Set up your relic and pass turn over to your opponent, and while Gullveig makes Asia monsters difficult to deal with, they're not exactly stellar interactions. Now, make no mistake, this play is repeatable, reliable, and makes the archetype run like clockwork. But once you're locked under Gullveig, you severely limit the number of options you have available to you. Gullveig, without question, makes Nordic a real threat. But other Link 1s open up way more options for far fewer resources and aren't reliant on forcing mediocre monsters into their deck in order for them to work. There is, however, a ton of potential behind the card, and if Nordics ever get some more support with some better combo pieces or end boards, she is definitely going to be an asset. Descending from the heavens at number 9 is Duralume Vaalmonican Heathen Hallow, the card that shows what happens when Selectrice listens to Angelo too much. Technically speaking, Duralume can be considered one of the most generic Link 1s in the game, as it can be made with any effect monster, but in order to actually summon it, you need to have 3 or more resonance counters on a fairy monster card that's in your pendulum zone, aka you need to have 3 counters on your Angelo. And its reliance on resonance counters doesn't stop there, as both of its effects use them as resources in some way. When Duralume is link summoned, you can essentially Raigeki away their entire board by targeting monsters they control, up to the number of resonant counters you have in your pendulum zone, and destroy them. Likewise, after popping your opponent's field, you can remove 3 resonance counters from either your pendulum scales to allow for your Duralume to make up to 3 attacks. Once again, it has to be stressed that even though Duralume is on this list, it's not actually a bad card. Quite the opposite, it's actually a pretty solid addition to Vaalmonica that really rounds out the strategy. Its first effect is a great way to clear away an opponent's board, and even has some applications as an interruption during your opponent's turn, where you can convert a single IP Masquerena into a Duralume to pop your opponent's field mid-combo, which can be a really nasty surprise. And after you've cleared the board away, you have an extremely easy path to lethal with Duralume's second effect, as it stands at an impressive 2500 attack, resulting in 7500 points of direct damage all by itself. The best part? It's actually pretty easy to bring out despite needing setup, because your pendulum scales both gain resonance counters whenever your life points change, with Domino gaining a counter whenever you take effect damage, and Angelo gaining one whenever you gain life points. And it just so happens that almost every Vaalmonica spell or trap card that you use in your game plan gives you the decision between either gaining or losing life points to activate different effects. So if you want to summon a Duralume, all you have to do is just keep listening to Angelo and activate the life gain effects of your Vaalmonica cards. But despite being a genuinely solid tool, most Vaalmonica players would rather listen to Domino on their shoulder instead, and for good reason. You see, while you do get to make the decision between the life loss or life gain effects of your Vaalmonica cards, so long as you have a Vaalmonica pendulum skill set up, the life loss effects that cause Demono to gain a counter are usually going to be your go-to choices for setting up a board. With Skelta, you get to add any Vaalmonica spell or trap card from your deck to your hand. Versar can Foolish a back row, and followed by Rhythm, which can bounce a monster to the hand. The life gain effects of Vaalmonica cards aren't terrible, but Demono offers you a much more reliable game plan to set up the deck's best interactions. And funnily enough, getting 3 counters in Demono is actually one of the deck's biggest priorities, as it allows you to summon your other archetypal link one, Zebufera, which is incredibly important to get, as not only can it protect your field from destruction, but it can also copy the effects of Vaalmonica back row that is banished or in your graveyard at quick effect speed during your opponent's turn. This is solid if you need some extra follow-up or advantage, but excels when paired with the likes of Followed Rhythm and the deck's field spell. With Zebufera, you can copy the effects of Followed Rhythm that you've used that turn, or one that you happen to send with the Versar that you can then use the effects to interact with your opponent with surgical precision, destroying their strongest back row and bouncing their best monsters, because you also happen to control a Vaalmonica link monster. And all the while, it makes it way easier to gain resonance counters on Angelo to trigger Ecological Snatch Steal to take control of an opponent's starter or boss monster. As a result, Zebufera is generally the preferred link monster between the two, and that can set up interaction with some real layers behind it, while Duralume is a bit of a one-trick pony. That's not to say Duralume is entirely redundant. On the contrary, it's quite a supplemental endboard piece if you can commit an IP Masquerena, and is an excellent way of sweeping up a duel in your favor with a swift OTK. But unlike Zebufera or even a card like Gullveig, Duralume doesn't make or break its particular strategy. You can easily win duels with Vaalmonica without ever needing to commit Duralume to the field once, especially when there are more generic options available that can do what it does. But in general, Duralume is a great option for Vaalmonica, and one that most pilots are glad to have in their extra deck. But given that it's such a low priority to bring out due to the existence of Zebufera, it seems like Selectrice gains a lot more from listening to Demono than she does Angelo. Securing the number 8 spot is Secure Gardna, a generic link monster with some specific but interesting uses. In order to bring out Secure Gardna, you can use any Cyberse link monster as a material, and after it's summoned, you don't take any effect damage for the rest of the turn. And the first time you would take any kind of damage each turn, Secure Gardna will protect you and make you take no damage at all. All of this with the only real downside being that you can't use Gardna as a link material at all. Both the Secure Gardna's effects are rarely ever going to have too much impact on a duel. They definitely make it a great option to counter burn strategies, and a Gardna on field can prevent you from being OTK'd in a pinch. But these effects don't really do anything to put a wrench in the game plan of most strategies, nor does it gain you any kind of real advantage. So it can seem like a pretty pointless tool most of the time, especially if you're summoning it to your extra monster zone, where its downside is going to lock you out of being able to special summon link monsters entirely due to its bad arrow. And that might make you think that Gardna is a little bit too high in this list due to its particular pigeonhole. But there is some secret utility to the card that's hard to see at first, solely because it's a light body you can use to siege your graveyard. This has a whole host of applications and a number of different strategies. In Dinosaur, for example, one of the deck's important combo pieces, Double Evolution Pill, requires you to banish a dinosaur and a non-dinosaur monster from your hand or graveyard, so that you can summon out a big dinosaur from your deck. And it can sometimes be pretty hard to have access to non-dinosaur monsters you're willing to banish. So back when Link Karuba was legal, after using the effect of Animadored Archosaur to search out a Double Evolution Pill, you will link it off for Linkuriboh, which you can then link away for Secure Gardna to put Linkuriboh in the grave, so that you had the right setup for your evolution pill. Although it wasn't just a dino where Gardna had its utility. As in Invoke strategies, it's a great option that can net you a lot of free fusion materials for Invocation, a spell that allows you to use fusion monsters from materials from your hand, field, or graveyard if you're using them for an invoked fusion monster. And for a while, Secure Gardna's existence meant that an Alistair the Invoker resulted in a true one-card combo to invoke Makaba, as after normal summoning Alistair to find Invocation, you can link away Alistair for Salamangreat Almirage, and then link away Almirage for Gardna, so that when you activate your fusion spell, you have Alistair in grave and a light monster on field to banish. However, both Invoked and Dinosaurs aren't exactly the most meta-relevant strategies in the world. And even if they were, there have been a few factors that have led to Secure Gardna seeing a steady decline of use over the years. The big one is honestly the banning of Linkuriboh, as other than Almirage, Linkuriboh was the easiest way for non-Cyber strategies to be able to bridge into a Cyber Link monster, which they could use as a material. And with it passing, Gardna has suddenly become a little bit more awkward to use in the likes of Dinosaur, where you now have to use Almirage to bridge into it, which can be difficult if you plan on spending your normal summon on an Oviraptor. And while a deck like Invoked definitely values its attributes, they have other options available, such as Artemis the Magistus Moon Maiden, which nets you a light monster on field by linking off Alistair, but requires one less extra deck slot and one less summon. That's not to say Gardna has dropped off the face of the earth entirely, and as we get more easy access to Cyber Link monsters, we'll likely see it on lists again. But as it stands, it's just a little bit too awkward to go into. Although right now, Secure Gardna is currently just somewhat redundant. The environment around the meta has shifted so that strategies that play it aren't too represented. The ban list has banned one of the easiest ways to summon it, and the decks using it now have a wider array of options to fulfill its particular utility. Dolled up at number 7 is Clara Rushka, the Ventrio Duo, the simplest Link monster in the game. In order to summon Clara Rushka, you need to use any monster in the game so long as it was originally normal summoned or set. And it's basically just a vanilla monster with its only effect being a restriction that prevents you from summoning it on any phase except for main phase 2. Now, without this restriction, this non-effect monster with 0 attack would actually be one of the best Link monsters in the game, as it would otherwise be a way for any deck to immediately set up the graveyard with the monster in their hand, giving you access to a whole host of powerful graveyard options depending on the strategy that you're playing. But as it stands right now, only being able to summon Clara Rushka in main phase 2 severely limits its utility. And while it might sometimes be a useful option when you're going second, you still have to give up your battle phase to get to a phase where you can even summon her, which can make things a little bit awkward if you need to bin in a monster to start a combo. But even with this restriction, and the fact that it's essentially got nothing going for it, Clara Rushka is honestly still a pretty solid card, and that can be seen on and off in competitive decks over the years. And its utility actually differs from decklist to decklist, and the likes of ABC and Altergeist, the Ventrio Duo, were a great way of getting the likes of Beatbuster Drake or Mulisex into the grave to trigger their effects, and was specifically great in Geist as an alternative to Linkuriboh, as its spellcaster typing allowed you to summon it when under Locked of Rivalry of Warlords. Likewise, this same typing would often make Clara Rushka really important in Sky Striker lists for a while, as it gave this spell-focused strategy a realistic way to beat a secret village of the spellcasters, where it would otherwise be locked out of the game. Even in the modern era, we've seen Clara Rushka put in the work within strategies like Labyrinth that have the Space Forward in their extra deck solely because it's an easy to bring out Link monster that is still technically an effect monster, so that you can use the on-summon effect of SP Little Knight by using it as a material. However, it's pretty rare that we ever see Clara Rushka in extra decks in general anymore. There's no doubt that the card has a lot of solid utility, but extra deck slots are really valuable in the modern era, and with a cavalcade of extenders, boss monsters, and other strong utility tools, it's often hard to justify a spot for Ventrio Duo, if it's only ever going to be useful when going second, and even then, in only specific circumstances when you could instead be playing other, more powerful options that have effects that make them far more useful than just getting a monster to the grave. But once again, Clara Rushka, despite seeming like it would be a bad card, is actually pretty great overall. And there are going to be formats where it sees play again for one reason or another, as it has a lot of hidden strength. But for the most part, with the extra deck being such an important tool for a lot of different decks, we'd have to expand the extra deck size by a lot if we wanted the Ventrio Duo to see consistent competitive play. And at number 6, we have Talkback Lancer, a Link monster that helps to enable a Cyber's extra Link. In order to make Talkback, you need a level 2 or lower Cyberse monster, and Cyberse Pile strategies are in no short supply. While it's on the field, you can use its effect to tribute a Cyberse monster to summon out a Code Talker in your graveyard with a different name than the monsters you tributed to a zone that Lancer points to. And for a while, this effect, as well as this particular arrow, made Talkback a pretty useful tool for Cyberse decks like Code Talker that were specialized to extra link opponents' monsters and lock them out of the game. All you had to do was free up your extra monster zones while you're comboing off, which is pretty easy given the number of good link arrows on Code Talker monsters, and then use a level 2 or lower Cyberse like Eebly or 4-Mud Skipper to bring out Talkback so that you can then bring out the likes of Transcode Talker or Xcode Talker to Talkback's link arrows so that they'll be co-linked, and with arrows that can be used to co-link to another monster to eventually complete a U-link. You can still just as easily throw Talkback Lancer into a Code Talker list if extra linking was your goal. And it can even be somewhat useful to help you rebuild a board by reviving your Code Talkers after you've ran through most of your extra deck. But more modern Code Talker lists aren't actually too focused on extra links. Right now, you're more likely to see a strategy trying to shoot Firewall Dragon Singularity or even just the original Firewall Dragon than anything, which has left cards like Talkback Lancer without a real home. Especially because even if you wanted to extra link in current Code Talker strategies, you no longer need to rely on Talkback to get you there. For as solid as its revival is, the deck is now better served by G-Golem Crystal Heart, as it's ironically much easier to access since it can be summoned with any 2 Cyberse monsters, including Link monsters, unlike Talkback, which specifically needs a monster with a level that's 2 or lower. And just like Talkback, Crystal Golem can bring out a Transcode Talker from your graveyard and have both of their arrows co-linked to one another, with Transcode also pointing right to ensure that you can continue an extra link and lock your opponent. So while Talkback Lancer generally has some solid strengths in Code Talker specifically, it's not a tool that you'll really need to rely on or even play in current lists due to other options just doing its job slightly better. And at number 5, we have Trickstar Bloom, one of Trickstar's archetypal link monsters designed to try to help you minus 200 your opponent to lethal. In order to bring up Bloom, you need to link away any level 2 or lower Trickstar monster, and when you do, you can use Bloom's on summon effect to give your opponent a free draw. And Bloom even has an extra bonus effect that lets you inflict 200 damage for every card in your opponent's hand if a Trickstar monster she points to is ever destroyed by battle or card effect. Now, these effects do have their use cases in a deck like Trickstar, where every point of burn can matter for trying to end the game. And even giving your opponent a free draw can theoretically help you end a duel faster by triggering the burn effect of Trickstar Licorice. However, Trickstar strategies never want to be in a position where using Bloom's effect is going to be the thing that determines whether or not you might win a duel. Her second effect can definitely do a lot of damage in one go, but it's a little awkward to trigger as it requires that Bloom is in the extra monster zone, and for you to be able to destroy a monster it points to in some way, which is difficult to do in Engine. And giving your opponent a free draw to trigger Licorice is a dangerous game, because while it definitely can get you closer to lethal, the extra resources you throw an opponent is more likely to help them than hurt them. Especially because you're risking a draw to more potential non-engine for them to be able to stop your combo or break your board with. Essentially, if you're ever in a position where you're using this effect, you have to be able to know that the duel is ending soon. Otherwise, you might have just given your opponent the key to turn the game on its head. But for as mediocre as its effects are, Bloom still has a lot of strength solely because it's easy to summon Trickstar monsters that can also trigger some graveyard effects. Unfortunately, Bloom can only really do this with a level 2 or lower Trickstar monster, but it enables some really creative ways of using your Trickstars. From Nightshade being able to be an instant link 2 because of Bloom's existence, to being able to get some extra burn in while Holy Angel is on the field by linking away a Trickstar token into Bloom while you're comboing off. And this same utility gets even better once the latest Trickstar support releases, as Trickstar Hoodie has a crazy effect when it's used as link material to add a Trickstar fusion from your deck to your hand to help you keep extending, and Bloom is a great way of triggering it. Now, technically speaking, once this support wave releases, Trickstar will also be getting a new Link 1 that's almost better than Bloom in every way. Not because of its effect, but because it can be summoned with any non-Link Trickstar monster, which opens up a lot more lines, especially with Hoodie needing a Trickstar Link on field to special summon for free. But even with that being the case, Bloom is still going to see playing Trickstar extra decks, as Trickstar Kolkika can only be special summoned once per turn, and having an extra way to bin your Trickstars is still going to be somewhat important. As a whole though, even post-support Trickstar isn't necessarily too amazing of a strategy, and Bloom is wholly limited by what its archetype can do. But it definitely provides a great service for Trickstars, even with it essentially just being used as a non-effect monster. But that's all she really needs to be, and while she's limited to only working well with Trickstars, it's wild to see how versatile she is for as bad as her effects are. And at number 4, we have S-Force Nightchaster, a Link monster that tries its best to support S-Force. In order to summon out Nightchaster, you can use any S-Force as long as it's not a Link monster, and keeping with the archetype's gimmick, they also have a column-based effect. In this case, Nightchaser's effect is the opposite and complementary effect to Rapid Chiyomaru's, as it prevents your opponent from being able to target monsters within their columns for attacks so long as there's an S-Force monster in their column. But the more interesting part of Nightchaser is its quick effect, which can be used during the main phase to shuffle back an S-Force monster you control into the deck so that you can special summon out one of your banished archetypal monsters. The idea behind this effect is actually pretty interesting. In order to get access to some of your most important effects, you need to banish an S-Force monster from your hand, such as the case of the aforementioned Rapid Chiyomaru, the deck's main combo starter that can bring out any S-Force monster directly from your deck. But being the deck's main starter makes Chiyomaru incredibly susceptible to hand traps, and because every S-Force monster banishes for cost, they trade pretty badly into any kind of interaction. But Nightchaser existing allows you to extend a little by linking away an interrupted Chiyomaru so that you can bring out the monster you banished earlier by returning itself to the extra deck to potentially allow the deck to try to beat a Stray Ash or Effect Veiler within its own engine. And combined with the fact that it provides the deck a pretty impressive grind game, Nightchaser absolutely gives S-Force a much needed extra deck tool to help guarantee their game plan. But it unfortunately just isn't enough. You see, Nightchaser is conceptually a great card, but it has a couple of things that are really holding it back. While it can technically be a great extender, it only has the potential if you happen to banish a strong S-Force monster from your hand. With Chiyomaru's effect, your main goal is usually trying to bring S-Force Gravitino out in some way so that you can search for S-Force Chase, which you'll usually do either directly with Chiyo's effect by banishing Gravitino from hand and summoning Platina to bring it back from your banishment, or even by summoning out Edge Razor with Chiyomaru to bring it out from hand. But if the card you've banished doesn't get you to Gravitino in some way, isn't an interaction, or maybe isn't even a monster to begin with, then Nightchaser can't really do much of anything to actually help out the strategy, as how good it will be as an extender will always be limited by the S-Force cards that you can get banished. And S-Force is just not equipped to always be able to find a way to banish its best extenders and enablers in every single hand. But even if Nightchaser does get you exactly what you want, S-Force just can't do much even when it does pop off, with your best hope being able to get access to your archetypal Compulse as well as Justify to act as an imperm if you have the perfect hand, which just isn't going to be enough to stop most decks any kind of real extension. If Nightchaser were Link 1 for any other banish focused strategy, it'd honestly be a pretty nice extender. But because of the archetype it's in, how strong Nightchaser can be is always going to be a bit of a toss-up. And even if she does her job, the payoff you get for it just isn't worth it due to how mediocre S-Force unfortunately is. Haunting the number 3 spot is Ghostrick Festival, one of the most unique Link monsters in the game. Festival has both an offensive and defensive effect. With its offensive effect, all of your Ghostrick monsters can attack directly so long as there's a Ghostrick card in your field zone. While with its defensive effect, if your opponent declares an attack, you can tribute it to special summon any Ghostrick monster from your deck in face down defense position. But the most interesting part of Festival is by far its summoning condition. You need to use a non-Link Ghostrick in order to bring it out to the field. But unlike every other Link monster in the game, you can actually Link summon this card by using a face down monster. And funnily enough, this particular summon condition is where Festival finds most of its strength. You see, while Ghostrick has a lot of variety in the archetypal effects, they all share a particular restriction that, for a while, really held them back, as no Ghostrick monster can be normal summoned unless you already control a Ghostrick monster face up, which meant that if you wanted to commit a Ghostrick to the board when you normal summoned, you'd have to set it face down, which, while not a huge problem in a deck with a back row designed to flip your cards face up, meant that the deck's turn 1 options were pretty limited. But Festival existing definitely opens up a wider array of plays on the first turn simply because you can set a Ghostrick and then immediately link it away to bring out Festival. And if you combine this with Ghostrick Shot, you can immediately bring the Ghostrick monster from your graveyard back face up on the field to take advantage of some of their strong on-field or graveyard effects depending on what you need. Or alternatively, if you don't have access to Shot, then Festival's arrows can also be used for summoning out Parallel Exceed, which can give you a rank 4 to go into Angel of Mischief to jumpstart your plays. But even with these cute little synergies that definitely makes Ghostrick a stronger deck overall, Festival is still an underwhelming Link monster as both of its effects, while fine enough, are just pretty mediocre, only barely helping the strategy. Being able to attack directly and bypass your opponent's face-up monsters is definitely cute utility, and can even sometimes help you OTK with enough Ghostricks. However, if you were capable of swarming the field with enough Ghost Tricks to threaten your opponent's life points, then you likely already had the gas to be able to end your opponent with the likes of Axis Code Talker or Borosor Dragon while removing any potential threats in the way. And if you're not ending the game with this effect, which you're likely going to struggle with given how hard it is to flood the field with Ghost Tricks as well as their pitifully low attack points, then your next best bet would either be enabling a Zeus with your Ghostrick Xyz monsters, which Ghostrick can already do with a strong pull of generic Xyz without relying on Festival, or you can gain easier access to Ghostrick Stein Search, which likely isn't going to be dual winning as you'd hope, especially given Angel of Mischief has already got you covered without the need to attack with its soft once per turn search. Now, the second Effects of Festival reads a lot stronger as a way of getting your engine rolling by summoning out any Ghostrick from your deck, albeit in face down defense position. But in order to even attempt to use this effect, your opponent has to declare an attack. And given the number of accessible removal tools in the modern era, your opponent just isn't going to willingly attack your monster if they have to worry about you gaining any kind of edge from this effect. They're just going to deal with it before the battle phase. And even if they don't, you need a specific set of cards to make the Ghost Tricks you summon useful most of the time, with you needing to set Ghost Trick Scare or Ghost Trick Go Round if you want to have any kind of disruption that might put a wrench into your opponent's plans. Still, Festival has some utility that makes it a pretty solid link monster for Ghost Tricks specifically, as it gives the deck some fine enough ways of starting your plays, although it's certainly not as revolutionary of a tool as Ghost Trick Shot is for aiding the strategy, and definitely doesn't allow for Ghost Tricks to even scrap the edge of competitive viability. And at number 2, we have Sunvine Gardna, a truly terrible link monster that, surprisingly, can still be used competitively, but it's still an awful choice even in spite of that. If you wanted to link summon Sunvine Gardna, you'd have to use a normal plant monster, as the Sunvine, Sun Avalon, and Sunseed cards all revolve around using Sunseed genus loci. And speaking of Sun Avalon, if Gardna is linked to a Sun Avalon link monster, then whenever your opponent declares an attack on Gardna, you can halve the damage you would take. And if Gardna ends up being destroyed by battle, you have to end the battle phase immediately after the damage step. Although if a Sun Avalon link monster leaves the field by a card effect, Gardna will end up destroying itself. But it's honestly not this downside that makes Gardna such a terrible card, as each Sunvine monster shares the same detail and they both still see play. What really drags down Gardna is that its effects are essentially pointless. The idea behind it is fine enough. None of your Sun Avalon monsters can be targeted for an attack, but your opponent can attack you directly if you have no other valid attack targets. So by keeping Gardna on field, it protects your life points from taking a ton of damage, while also still allowing for the likes of Dryas to trigger and net you some free advantage in the process by summoning out another Sunvine monster from your extra deck. And while this is somewhat mediocre utility, it's utility nonetheless. But in practice, no strategy would ever use Gardna in this way. In fact, most decks incorporating Sun Avalon engines would rarely ever end their turn with a Sun Avalon or Sunvine monster on their field. You see, the Sunseed cards do one important thing for plant strategies. They generate a ton of bodies with a loci, as you can turn that loci into a Dryas, which can search for a Sowing. Sowing can then summon a Twin while also making you take effect damage, so that on a new chain you can use Twin to summon out loci from your graveyard and Dryas to summon out a Sunvine monster from your extra deck, resulting in 4 bodies from just a single card. And it's through Dryas' effect where the Sunvine monsters can really shine, as they end up being free bodies that you can use to further your link plays. So if you ever see a Sunvine Gardna in your opponent's field, it's likely that they're not going to stay there for very long. But even in this scenario, you would never summon Gardna specifically, as its effects is the worst of the 3 Sunvine monsters by a lot. Sunvine Thrasher, for example, can reach 1600 attack solely by targeting Dryas, which makes it easier to leverage battle phases in your favor and potentially crash against the likes of an SP. But the prize flower of this particular garden is Sunvine Healer, which allows you to gain life points. And this effect is deceptively powerful because it gives Sun Avalon some really solid synergy with Aroma, another archetype that's incorporated into the plant pile that gains advantage from gaining life points. For example, if you can commit an Aroma Safari Jasmine to the field before you use Healer's effect on Dryas, you can trigger Jasmine's effect to get a free search. But even if that's just out of reach, Healer's life point gain is a great way to turn on some of your Aroma extenders. As a result, Healer is without a doubt the best of the 3 Sunvine monsters, and one that you'll usually see brought out from Dryas or even summoned normally with loci. But if you wanted to hold off from bringing out Healer until later in your turn, some versions of Plant will play Healer and a Thrasher in their extra deck, because while Thrasher isn't a broken card by any means, its potential stats give it some extra offensive merit. Gardna just doesn't hold a candle to either. Its effect is purely defensive, as if you tried to use it offensively by crashing it, you'd be down a body and forced to end your own battle phase, which is pretty pointless. Now, technically speaking, Gardna has more utility than a lot of other cards on this list, because even though it can basically be seen as a worse version of Healer or Thrasher, it's still a free body that you can bring out. But Gardna is just never going to see play in place of either, since its effects just aren't going to be as useful. And that makes Gardna worse than just being bad. It's redundant. If you're ever in a position where you're considering playing it to summon from Dryas, you can just run any of the Sunvine monsters instead, and they're always going to be better. With that being said, Gardna is undeniably a playable card due to the cards surrounding it. Sun Avalon is a solid strategy that makes bringing it to the field a cinch, and it can allow for it to be an easy way to bring out a plant body. But its effects are so terrible, there's no reason you'd ever summon Gardna specifically. In fact, there's no reason you'd ever play Gardna, as even with Healer limited to 1 copy, it would be a better choice to play 3 copies of Thrasher before you ever consider playing 1 Gardna. And heating things up at number 1 is Appliancer Dryer Drake, the worst Link 1 in the game. To summon out Dryer Drake, you need to link away an Appliancer Link monster, but Dryer Drake itself can't be used as Link material the turn you Link summon it. And interestingly, it has 3 effects depending on whether it's linked and or co-linked. If Dryer Drake is linked to a monster, i.e. pointing at one or one is pointing at it, then it'll automatically gain 1000 attack. Meanwhile, if it's co-linked, i.e. arrows pointing at each other, then during the battle phase, you can switch the zones of 2 Appliancer monsters in your main monster zone, including Drake itself, so that the other monster you target can make a second attack. And if Drake isn't co-linked, if it's targeted for an attack, you get to negate the attack. Now, we've discussed how a lot of what determines how strong a Link 1 can be is the archetypes surrounding it in a lot of the earlier entries on this list. And it pains me to say it that Appliancer definitely isn't the best deck out there. It has the ability to spit out an uncanny amount of Link materials to enable some generic boss monsters, but doesn't have too much to do other than that, and it needs to have the right kind of hands or alternative engines to push as far as you'd hope. So a lot of times the deck needs to be able to rely on its archetypal Link monsters, most of which could have filled up most of the spots on this list. Not because they're genuinely terrible, but because they're strictly limited to a somewhat mediocre archetype that's unfortunately missing something. Laundry Dragon and Vaculephant are great removal, Kappa Scale has some solid recursion, and both Dryer Drake and Propelion are fine OTK tools when paired with the deck's archetypal Link 2 and Celtopus. But Dryer Drake specifically is on this list, because in this pretty bad archetype, it's definitely the worst Link monster of the bunch. You see, the other of the Appliancer Link ones can theoretically always do something by themselves. A Laundry Dragon or Propel Lion can flex the battle phase to out an opponent's monster, Vaculephant can destroy any of the cards on the field by pitching a card, even a Kappa Scale can set up your graveyard for an Appliancer reuse to shine. But the only thing Dryer Drake does by itself is stop a single attack, which is only going to prevent an opponent's OTK if they actively choose not to read your cards. And even then, it might not be enough. Instead, for Dryer Drake to truly be useful, you need to set up a Celtopus, another Appliancer Link 1, and Dryer Drake itself so that you can use its effects while it's co-linked to allow the likes of Laundry Dragon or Propel Lion to attack multiple times, getting rid of your opponent's best monsters. Or if you have a way to Appliancer conversion, you can even OTK with the right setup. And while this is a fine enough use, there's a few key issues with this setup. Namely, it requires a Link 4's worth of materials in order for Drake to actually be somewhat relevant. And while this is something Appliancers can definitely do, those materials could be better spent on other Link options that can either prove more versatile or just help you OTK without needing to find a conversion. You just have to do more for Drake when you could otherwise do what it wants to do but way easier. For being the worst Link 1 in the game, Dryer Drake isn't a horrible card. If you have the setup and everything goes right, it works really well with your other Appliancer monsters. But what makes it so bad in comparison to other Link 1s is that it requires an insane amount of investment that can be better used elsewhere, even within its own archetype. If you're ever in a position where Drake seems like a good move, you likely already had everything you needed to win the duel anyway, and likely through a much more optimal path. But it definitely says something about the power of Link 1s in general that the worst card in the pool isn't actually a bad card. It's just mediocre and part of a pretty bad deck. And that's the list. If you think there's any other Link 1s we may have missed, or you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.